It's not exactly a newsflash that the United States military is under assault. What is a little surprising, though, is that some of the most serious fire that our men and women in uniform are taking at the moment, at least in a metaphorical sense, is coming from a number of Americans, including, most frighteningly, from their commander-in-chief. Let me give you a couple of examples of things that are evidence of this kind of sustained and increasingly ominous assault on those who are protecting the security of this country. First of all, of course, there's the business with General McChrystal, the man President Obama appointed a few months back and charged with executing a counterinsurgency strategy against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. General McChrystal, a serious and experienced and successful counterinsurgency soldier of the United States Army, came back, as he was expected to do earlier this summer, with specific recommendations as to what it's going to take to resource that agreed strategy. Lo and behold, in the intervening months, it appears that the president's political base has essentially said, you know, that good war, that war of necessity thing, we don't think so. It's enough that we just do a counter-terrorism campaign waged not against the Taliban but against Al-Qaeda only. And that, the proponents of this idea, like Vice President Joe Biden, appear to believe, can be done with even fewer troops than we have on the ground in Afghanistan now. Now, as Andy McCarthy has pointed out in a series of marvelous pieces in National Review Online, and I really commend those to you, Afghanistan is really just a symptom of a larger problem, and it doesn't appear that anybody in the Obama administration has really got its head around that larger problem, namely the fact we're up against Sharia, this ideology that animates our enemies in Afghanistan and an awful lot of other places as well, including here at home. But anyway, General McChrystal came forward with recommendations about what to do in the theater that he's responsible for, Afghanistan, and has essentially been treated like chopped liver. He's been dressed down by the president himself on the tarmac in Copenhagen, on the margins of that ill-fated Olympic bid. He has been subjected to really scurrilous attacks by both elected members of the president's party in Congress and by unaccountable, unelected folks in the left blogosphere and elsewhere, on the grounds that somehow he has departed from the best traditions of the military, which is to provide their advice as to what is required to do their job. He has done so, I think, in an entirely appropriate fashion. It's just that they're shooting the messenger. They're not interested in what General McChrystal has to say. And this is compounding, I think, the larger problem that the president's palpable indecision, if not actual fecklessness, about what to do about Afghanistan is causing in terms of diminished morale of our forces on the ground. After all, who wants to be, as they say, the last guy killed fighting the Taliban if the government of the United States is about to say, hey, you know, it's okay with us if the Taliban take over here? There's also rules of engagement that have been adopted in Afghanistan since the Obama administration came to office that have, I'm afraid, put many of our troops on the ground unnecessarily in harm's way, unable to bring the full effectiveness of our force to bear to defend themselves, let alone to defeat the enemy, in the interest, laudable, understandable interest of not causing undue civilian casualties. The problem is American servicemen and women are getting killed as we try not to hurt Afghan civilians who are being, in many cases, used quite deliberately by the Taliban as shields. So the problem one is what the president is doing by way of dissing his commanders. And by the way, it's General Petraeus, the Central Command commander, it's Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who in addition to General McChrystal have said publicly that they think we need more forces on the ground in Afghanistan if we are to avoid failure. A second area of problems associated with the Obama administration's management, or assault, if you will, on the military, involves its hollowing out. This was a term that was used decades ago during the Carter administration, which increasingly seems to be a precursor to the present one. This president has gotten virtually all of the defense budget cuts that he sought out of the Congress. They are leaving the military seriously strapped for funds, most especially in the area that is vital not only to fighting today's wars, but to hopefully deterring those in the future and, if necessary, waging and winning them, namely the modernization and procurement accounts. By some estimates, that's as much as $50 billion underfunded. That means that we will be saddling not only today's forces, but those for many years to come, with inadequate kit with which to defend themselves and to perform the missions that are given to them. Two other areas of particular concern in terms of this hollowing out problem. The president has not only decided to abandon our NATO allies by canceling the missile defense program designed to protect them as well as us against the sort of longer and longer range missiles the Iranians are steadily developing. He's also cut $1 billion out of the other missile defense, I should say, accounts, which means that inexorably there will be less capability on our part to defend against such threats and, in a way, an incentive to those who are acquiring these missiles to continue to pursue them and perhaps ultimately to use them, knowing that they will have a free ride. No less troubling is the president's pursuit of a nuclear weapons-free world. As we've talked about here before, there's only one country that he can actually denuclearize, and that's us. He seems hard at it. In fact, he is reportedly sent back to the Pentagon for change and downward revision its plan for the number of nuclear forces that it thinks we need for the foreseeable future. The president apparently is insisting that they take out at least an entire wing of Minuteman III missiles, the cumulative effect of which, especially when we fail to modernize our forces, any of our nuclear forces, or their delivery vehicles, is to make our deterrent less credible, less reliable, less effective than it needs to be in a world that is becoming, whether we like it or not, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, ever more dangerous. And then there's a third problem, a frontal attack, really, on the military culture that is so critical to what is called good order and discipline of our armed forces, the kind of unit cohesion, the integrity, and ultimately the operational capability that our men and women in uniform are required by our security interests to provide. This assault takes the form of the determination the president reiterated yet again last weekend to a homosexual group that he will repeal, apparently, the statutory prohibition on homosexuals serving openly in the United States military. This is sometimes referred to as don't ask, don't tell. It's confusing. It's irrelevant. What he has to do to pander to gay, bisexual, lesbian, transgender, and who knows what all other kinds of sexual predilections is to repeal the law that is on the books now that prohibits their service in the United States military. 1,100 plus former retired and very respected general officers and flag officers have written the president and the Congress warning in the strongest possible terms against this action. I'd like to read for you a quote, which you can find at www.flagandgeneralofficersforthemilitary.org. .com. They wrote in this open letter, quote, "Our past experience as military leaders leads us to be greatly concerned about the impact of repeal of this law on morale, discipline, unit cohesion, and overall military readiness. We believe that imposing this burden on our men and women in uniform would undermine recruiting and retention, impact leadership at all levels, have adverse effects on the willingness of parents who lend their sons and daughters to military service, and eventually break the all-volunteer force." Now, this isn't the opinion of some social scientist. This isn't the estimation of activists, including some who've been at various levels of the United States military, homosexuals who think they know best. This isn't the view necessarily of members of Congress. This is the view, the considered judgment of many of the nation's most important, most accomplished, most decorated senior officers who have collectively said, you will break the all-volunteer force if you try to impose this assault on the military culture on our armed forces. You may disagree with that. The President evidently has disregarded it. I pray that members of Congress who will be responsible for repealing this legislation, if indeed this very bad idea goes forward, will think long and hard about disregarding that considered judgment in time of war when we have but one military. The Commander-in-Chief, I submit, has a responsibility to appreciate that fact. We have but one military. And that this wartime moment is an especially ill-advised time to be undermining it, hollowing it out, or otherwise assaulting it. His failure to understand that reality, just how unique, just how perishable the armed forces are, and his willingness to engage in those kinds of assaults against it, is a dereliction of his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief and puts us all, if uncorrected, at ever greater peril. Thanks for listening.